I'm writing this from a motel room in town because yesterday morning I found a massive handprint pressed into the mud right outside our bedroom window. The fingers were longer than any human hand, and whatever made it had been standing there watching us sleep. That was the final straw. After weeks of finding our farm gates mysteriously open, dead chickens with finger marks around their necks, and footprints twice the size of my boots, I loaded my stroke-damaged wife into our old truck and got the hell out of there. I've been a farmer for 43 years. I know the difference between bear tracks and something else. I know what normal animal behavior looks like, and I know when wild creatures are acting scared of something bigger than them. What's been happening on our property isn't normal, and it's been getting bolder every single day. My wife saw them first, which sounds crazy given her condition, but I'm starting to think her damaged brain might actually see things more clearly than mine does. She's been trying to warn me for weeks, and I almost waited too long to listen. We've been married for 43 years, and she's been sick for the last 3. Started with a stroke that left her unable to speak properly, then the doctor said early dementia was setting in too. Most days she just sits and stares, but sometimes, and this is important, sometimes she sees things the rest of us miss. I used to think it was just her illness playing tricks on her mind. Now I know better. Our farm sits on 30 acres in the middle of nowhere, backing up against thousands of acres of state forest. We bought it when we were young and stupid, thinking we'd raise a bunch of kids here and live off the land. The kids came and went. They're scattered across 3 different states now with families of their own. They call sometimes, but visits are rare. Can't blame them really. It's hard to watch someone you love disappear a little more each day. I've been keeping a journal since last fall. The doctor told me I might be showing early signs of Parkinson's. Just a tremor in my left hand so far, but he said writing would help keep my mind sharp and my fingers working. So every night after I get her settled, I sit at the kitchen table and write about our day. Simple stuff mostly. How many eggs we got from the chickens, whether the fence needs fixing. Little moments when my wife seems like her old self again. It was the second week of April when everything started going wrong. I'd set my wife up on the front porch like always, wrapped in her favorite quilt with a cup of tea getting cold beside her. She loves watching the world wake up in the morning. The birds, the way the light changes, sometimes deer grazing at the edge of our property. I was out checking the chicken coop when I heard her making these urgent little sounds. When I looked over, she was pointing toward the tree line and trying to say something. Not her usual confused mumbling, but like she was trying to warn me about something specific. I followed her gaze, but didn't see anything unusual, just the thick stand of pine trees that marks the beginning of the state forest. But she kept it up all morning, pointing and making those sounds, getting more agitated when I couldn't understand what she was trying to tell me. Finally, I walked over to where she was pointing and looked into the woods myself. Nothing. Just shadows and the usual tangle of undergrowth. That night in my journal, I wrote, "Wife seemed upset about something in the forest today. Probably saw a deer or maybe a bear. Spring is definitely here. Found wildflowers blooming by the creek." The next few days were the same. Every morning I'd set her up on the porch, and every morning she'd spend hours staring at those trees like she was watching a movie only she could see. I started paying closer attention to where exactly she was looking, and it was always the same spot. A dense section of forest about 100 yards from the house where the trees grow thick and the shadows stay dark even in full daylight. By the end of the week, I was getting curious enough to do some investigating. I told her I was going to check the back fence line, but instead I circled around through the barn and positioned myself where I could watch both her and the forest without being seen. For 20 minutes, nothing happened. She sat there peacefully, occasionally lifting her face to catch the morning sun. I was starting to feel foolish, crouched behind a pile of old feed sacks, when her whole posture changed. Back straight, head turned toward the trees, that intense focus I'd been seeing all week. I followed her gaze and felt my stomach drop. Something was moving in the shadows between the trees. Something big. At first glance, I thought it might be a person. It was upright and moving with purpose rather than the random wandering of an animal. But the proportions were all wrong. Too tall, too broad through the shoulders. And the way it moved was strange, careful and deliberate, like it was trying not to be seen, but also like it was studying us. I watched for maybe 5 minutes before it melted back deeper into the forest and disappeared, but I was sure of what I'd seen. Something was out there, and it was watching us. That night, my wife spoke for the first time in over a year. I had just gotten her ready for bed and was settling down with my journal when I heard her voice from the bedroom, clear as anything. "Why don't you invite them inside?" I dropped my pen and went to check on her. She was lying there looking right at me, more alert than she'd been in months. I asked her what she meant, who she was talking about. But by the time I reached the bedside, that distant look had returned to her eyes. Whatever moment of clarity she'd had was gone. The next evening, it happened again. I was reading in the living room while she dozed in her chair when she suddenly sat up straight and said, "They're out there, you know." This time I was ready. I knelt down beside her chair and asked her to tell me more. Who was out there? Where? But she just looked at me with these confused, frightened eyes, and then seemed to shrink back into herself. This pattern continued for the next 2 weeks. Every night around the same time, she would have these brief episodes where she'd say something about them, whoever they were. They watch us during the day. They don't like loud noises. They're getting closer. The big one is teaching the little ones. That last comment stuck with me. Teaching them what and how many were there? I started carrying my old shotgun when I did my outdoor chores. Not openly. I didn't want to frighten my wife any more than she already seemed to be. But I kept it close by, leaning against whatever building I was working near. I also began walking the perimeter of our property more regularly, looking for signs. It didn't take long to find them. After a spring rain, I discovered tracks near the creek that runs along the back edge of our land. They were in a muddy section where the bank was soft, and they were unlike anything I'd ever seen. Human-shaped but enormous, at least 18 inches long and proportionally wide. The toe impressions were particularly disturbing, long and thick, more like fingers than toes. But what really got my attention was that there were multiple sets, at least 4 different sizes, ranging from prints that were merely huge down to some that were only about 12 inches long. That suggested we weren't dealing with just one creature, but a whole family group, and some of them were young. I followed the tracks as far as I could. They led to a rocky area where the ground was too hard to hold impressions, but the direction was clear. They were moving parallel to our property line, staying just inside the forest, but close enough to keep the house in sight. Over the next few days, I found more evidence. Broken branches at heights no human could reach, strange constructions made from stacked stones and twisted saplings. Not random debris, but deliberate arrangements that served some purpose I couldn't figure out. And the smell. In certain areas of the forest, there was a thick, musky odor that reminded me of a zoo on a hot day. My wife's nighttime episodes became more frequent and more detailed. She started talking about them during the day too, short bursts of clarity where she would point toward the forest and say things like, "The mother is teaching them to hunt," or "they're arguing about us." When I tried to get her to explain, she would slip back into her confused state, leaving me with more questions than answers. It was late April when I had my first clear sighting of the family. I was replacing some rotted boards on the chicken coop when I heard my wife making those urgent sounds from the porch. When I looked up, she was pointing frantically toward the tree line, more agitated than I'd ever seen her. This time, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my shotgun and moved to where I could get a better view of what had her so excited. There were 3 of them standing just inside the shadow of the trees, maybe 70 yards away. Even at that distance, their size was intimidating. The largest one had to be at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark, matted hair that looked almost black in the shadows. But it was the 2 smaller ones that really caught my attention. They were obviously juveniles, still huge by human standards, maybe 6 feet tall each, but clearly young by the way they stayed close to the adult and mimicked its movements. They weren't trying to hide, they were watching us openly, and I got the distinct impression this was intentional. The large one, I assumed it was the mother, pointed directly at me, then at my wife, then back at me. It was clearly some kind of communication, though I had no idea what it meant. I raised my shotgun, more to get a better view through the sight than because I intended to shoot. Through the iron sights, I could see details that made my hands shake. Their faces were almost human, but not quite. Broader, more primitive, with deep-set eyes that seemed to hold an unsettling intelligence. The mother's gaze met mine, and for a moment we just stared at each other across that distance. Then she turned and walked deeper into the forest, and the 2 juveniles followed. But this time, they weren't trying to be quiet. They crashed through the underbrush loudly, breaking branches and disturbing smaller trees. It sounded like a small bulldozer moving through the woods, and I realized it was a message. They wanted me to know they were leaving, but also that they could make as much or as little noise as they chose. When I looked back at my wife, she had calmed down and was staring at me with an expression I hadn't seen in years. She looked almost proud, as if I had finally understood something important. That night, she spoke more clearly than she had since her stroke. "They're not bad," she said as I was helping her into bed. "Just curious, the little ones especially." I asked her what she meant, but she was already drifting off to sleep. I sat up most of the night writing about the encounter and trying to make sense of what was happening. A family of unknown creatures living in our woods, apparently studying us as much as we were studying them. And my wife seemed to understand them better than I did. The next few weeks brought regular sightings. Once I knew what to look for and where to look, I spotted them almost daily. Usually it was just the juveniles, playing what looked like games in the forest clearing or practicing skills I could only guess at. They would chase each other through the trees with surprising grace for their size, or work together to build those strange constructions I'd been finding. But it was their intelligence that really unnerved me. These weren't just animals following instincts. They used tools, rocks to break open nuts, sticks to extract insects from logs. I watched one of the juveniles spend an entire afternoon trying to figure out how our water pump worked, studying it from different angles and even touching the metal housing when it thought I wasn't watching. I started venturing into the forest with my shotgun, partly out of curiosity and partly to establish some kind of boundary. I never went far, just to the edge of the tree line, but I wanted them to know I was armed and paying attention. The first time I did this, all 3 of them appeared within minutes, not threatening, but clearly responding to my presence in their territory. The mother stayed back about 50 feet, watching while the 2 juveniles circled around to get a better look at me from different angles. Their movements were coordinated, strategic. When I raised my shotgun, they immediately backed off, but they didn't flee. They just repositioned themselves at a safer distance and continued observing. I realized they were testing me as much as I was testing them. This became a regular routine. Every few days, I would walk to the edge of the forest, and they would appear to evaluate the situation. We developed a kind of mutual understanding. I wouldn't venture deeper into their territory, and they would maintain their distance from the house and barn. It was an uneasy truce, but it seemed to be working. Until the night everything changed. I was woken around 2 a.m. by the sound of our gate alarm, a simple bell system I'd rigged up to let me know if any of the animal enclosures were opened. I grabbed my shotgun and a flashlight and went out to investigate. Every single gate was standing wide open. The chickens were scattered across the yard, some already making their way toward the forest. The goats were nowhere to be seen, and the 2 old cows were standing at the edge of the pasture looking confused and nervous. It took me the rest of the night and most of the next day to round up all the animals. The gates hadn't just come open on their own. Each one was secured with a latch that required deliberate manipulation to open. Someone or something had gone around to every enclosure and systematically released our animals. But here's what really bothered me. Not a single animal had been harmed. If this was meant as an attack, it was a remarkably gentle one. It felt more like a prank or a test of some kind. I reinforced all the latches and added extra security, but I knew that if these creatures had the intelligence and dexterity to open them once, they could probably do it again. I started bringing the animals into the barn at night, which meant more work for me but gave me some peace of mind. My wife's condition seemed to be changing along with the escalating situation outside. Her moments of clarity became less frequent, but when they did occur, they were more intense and more specific. She would grab my arm with surprising strength and whisper urgent information. The mother is getting impatient. They want to show us something. The little ones are learning bad habits. It was this last comment that worried me most. Learning bad habits from whom? And what kind of habits? I got my answer 2 weeks later. I was working in the vegetable garden when I heard my wife crying out from the porch. Not her usual soft sounds, but genuine alarm calls. I dropped my tools and ran to see what was wrong. She was pointing at the kitchen window, trembling with fear. When I looked where she was indicating, I saw it immediately. A massive handprint on the glass, made with what looked like mud but smelled much worse. The print was enormous, easily twice the size of my own hand, with long, thick finger marks that had been pressed against the window with enough force to leave clear impressions. But this wasn't the work of the mother. The print was too small, too crude. One of the juveniles had approached the house during the day while we were both outside and marked our window. It was a bold move that crossed the invisible boundary we'd established. I spent the rest of the day checking every window and door on the house. I found 2 more prints, one on the barn door and another on the side of the chicken coop, all at different heights, suggesting more than one juvenile had been involved. They were getting braver, more willing to venture close to our buildings. That evening, I walked to the forest edge with my shotgun, hoping to re-establish the boundaries. All 3 appeared as usual, but this time the mother's body language was different. More aggressive, more protective. She positioned herself between me and the juveniles and made a low rumbling sound that I felt as much as heard. When I raised my shotgun, she didn't back off like before. Instead, she took a step forward and made the sound again, louder this time. The message was clear. The rules had changed. I retreated to the house, but I could feel them watching me the entire way back. The comfortable distance we'd maintained was collapsing, and I wasn't sure what would replace it. The answer came that very night. Around 3 a.m., I was woken by heavy footsteps circling the house, not trying to be quiet anymore. Deliberate, measured steps that made the floorboards creak even though they were walking on the ground outside. I counted at least 3 different rhythms, which confirmed all 3 were involved. Then came the knocking, slow, deliberate raps on the walls, moving from window to window around the entire house. Not random knocking, a pattern. 3 quick raps, pause, 3 quick raps, pause. They kept it up for almost an hour, and every time they completed a circuit of the house, the knocking got louder. My wife had gone completely silent, but I could feel her trembling in the bed beside me. When I looked at her face in the dim light, her eyes were wide with terror. But there was also something else there, recognition. She knew what this meant, even if I didn't. By dawn, the sounds had stopped, but the psychological impact was devastating. My wife spent the entire next day in a state of near catatonia, staring at the walls and occasionally whimpering. I couldn't leave her alone to do chores, so I brought her with me everywhere, carrying a chair so she would have somewhere to sit while I worked. The animals were acting even stranger than before. The chickens refused to leave the coop even when I scattered grain in the yard. The goats pressed themselves against the far wall of their enclosure as far from the forest as they could get. The cows wouldn't stop lowing, a low, mournful sound that went on all day and into the night. I realized we were under some kind of siege. The nighttime visitations became a regular occurrence over the next 2 weeks. Every night, the footsteps would circle the house. Every night, the knocking would start around 3 a.m. and continue until dawn. The pattern never varied, but the intensity kept increasing. By the end of the second week, they were pounding on the walls hard enough to rattle dishes in the cabinets. During the day, I caught more frequent glimpses of them moving through the forest. Sometimes I counted as many as 5 different figures. Apparently, more family members had joined the group. They range in size from what looked like juveniles to massive adults, and they no longer bothered to hide their presence. They seemed to be taking shifts watching the house, ensuring that we were never unobserved. I tried venturing into the forest with my shotgun one more time, hoping to re-establish some kind of communication. But the moment I stepped past the tree line, they surrounded me. Not threateningly, but completely. I counted 6 of them positioned in a loose circle around me, all just watching and waiting to see what I would do. The largest one, bigger even than the mother I'd first seen, stepped forward and made a series of sounds that were clearly some kind of language. Clicks and grunts and low rumbles that had rhythm and structure. It was trying to communicate with me, but I had no idea what it was saying. When I didn't respond, it tried again, more urgently this time. Then it pointed back toward the house, where I could see my wife sitting on the porch in her chair. It made more sounds, gesturing between her and me and then toward deeper parts of the forest. I had the terrifying realization that it was trying to negotiate something. Maybe they wanted us to leave. Maybe they wanted us to come with them. Or maybe they were trying to explain something I was too limited to understand. I backed away slowly, keeping my shotgun lowered but ready. They let me go, but I could feel their eyes on me the entire way back to the house. That was the last time I entered their territory. My wife's condition deteriorated rapidly after that encounter. She stopped eating regular meals and was barely drinking water. She would sit in her chair and stare at nothing, occasionally mumbling words I couldn't understand. The few times she did speak clearly, it was to beg me to make them go away or to apologize for something she couldn't explain. "I'm sorry," she said one evening as I was trying to get her to eat some soup. "I led them to us. I didn't mean to, but I did." I asked her what she meant, but she just shook her head and wouldn't say anything more. Sleep deprivation and constant stress were taking their toll on both of us. I was starting to see shadows where there weren't any and jumping at sounds that turned out to be nothing. My hands shook constantly now, though I couldn't tell if it was from the Parkinson's or just fear. The final escalation came on a night in early June. The usual routine started around 3 a.m., footsteps and knocking. But this time they added something new, scratching sounds on the roof, like they were trying to find a way in from above. Then the front door handle started turning back and forth slowly and deliberately. They were testing every possible entry point. My wife sat up in bed and said, in the clearest voice I'd heard from her in months, "They're not leaving until we give them what they want." I asked her what they wanted, but before she could answer, we heard the sound of breaking glass from the kitchen. One of them had thrown something through the window. Not a rock, but what looked like a carved piece of wood with symbols scratched into it. That's when I made the decision to leave. I'd been avoiding it because this farm was our whole life. 40 years of memories, 40 years of work building something that was ours. But watching my wife deteriorate in front of my eyes, I realized that no piece of property was worth her sanity or our lives. The truck had been sitting in the barn for 2 years, but I'd kept it in running condition out of habit. I spent the next day getting it road ready while my wife sat in the barn with me, wrapped in her quilt, watching me work with more interest than she'd shown in anything for weeks. I packed only the essentials: clothes, medications, important papers, and a few photographs. Everything else would have to stay behind. I loaded our suitcases into the truck bed and covered them with a tarp, trying to make it look like routine maintenance in case they were watching. They were definitely watching. As I prepared the truck, I could see movement throughout the forest. More activity than I'd observed before, as if they sensed something was changing. That evening, the knocking started earlier and lasted longer. The footsteps around the house seemed more agitated, faster, and less rhythmic than before. My wife had one final moment of clarity that night. As I was helping her get ready for what I hoped would be our last night in the house, she grabbed my hand and looked directly into my eyes. "They know," she said. "They know we're leaving, and they don't want us to go." I asked her why, but she was already drifting away again. However, her words sent a chill through me. If these creatures had formed some kind of attachment to us, or if they saw us as their territory in some way, leaving might not be as simple as I'd hoped. I loaded my wife into the truck just before dawn, while the forest was still quiet. She seemed more alert than she'd been in days, looking around with obvious fear, but also a kind of relief. I think she understood that we were escaping something dangerous. The engine turned over on the first try, and I said a silent prayer of gratitude. I pulled out of the barn slowly, trying not to make too much noise, and headed down our long driveway toward the main road. That's when I saw them. They were standing in a line across the driveway about 50 yards from the house. All 6 of them, from the massive adult I'd encountered in the forest down to what looked like a child. They weren't moving, just standing there watching us approach. The morning light gave me my clearest view yet of what we'd been dealing with. They were definitely not human, but they weren't quite apes either. Something in between, something that shouldn't exist according to everything I've been taught about the world. Their faces showed intelligence and emotion, and what I saw there was unmistakably sadness. They looked like a family watching friends move away. I stopped the truck about 20 feet from them, unsure what to do. Part of me wanted to turn around and go back to the house, to try to find some way to coexist with these creatures. But one look at my wife, trembling in the passenger seat, reminded me why we had to leave. The largest one, the one I thought of as the patriarch, stepped forward and placed one massive hand on the hood of the truck. He looked through the windshield at my wife, then at me, and I swear I could see pleading in his eyes. My wife surprised me by rolling down her window. In the clearest voice I'd heard from her in months, she said, "We have to go. I'm sorry, but we can't stay anymore." The creature stared at her for a long moment, then slowly nodded. He stepped back and gestured to the others, and they moved aside to let us pass. As we drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw them standing in our driveway, watching until we disappeared around the curve. We've been staying with our daughter in Ohio for 4 months now. My wife's condition has improved dramatically since we left the farm. She's still not the woman she used to be, but the constant fear and agitation are gone. She sleeps through the night and has even started speaking in complete sentences again sometimes. I've been thinking about going back to check on the property, maybe put it up for sale. But every time I start to make plans, my wife gets anxious and starts talking about them again. She insists they're still there, still waiting for us to come home. I've been researching our experience, trying to find other people who might have encountered similar things. There are more stories out there than I expected, but most people are afraid to talk about it openly. can't blame them. Until it happened to us, I would have thought they were all crazy too. The farm is still ours, technically. Our neighbor has been keeping an eye on things, though he hasn't reported seeing anything unusual. Maybe the creatures moved on after we left. Maybe they're still there, taking care of the land in their own way. Sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I wonder if we made a mistake leaving. My wife seemed to understand them in ways I never could. Maybe there was a possibility for coexistence that I was too frightened to explore. Maybe we could have found a way to share that land peacefully. But then I remember the fear in my wife's eyes during those long nights of knocking and scratching, and I know we made the right choice. Some mysteries are too dangerous to solve, and some bridges aren't meant to be crossed. The farm will always be ours in memory, but in reality, it belongs to them now. I just hope they're happier there than we were at the end. On February 14, 1986, Forest Ranger Jeff Hartwell ventured into the frozen wilderness of northern Idaho's Panhandle National Forests and never returned. 3 days later, searchers found his Canon AE-1 program camera buried in snow at the base of a massive pine tree, its strap severed and lens cracked from impact. When the film was developed, the final photographs revealed something that should not exist. Something that had been stalking Jeff through the winter forest with an intelligence that was unmistakably, terrifyingly human. Jeff's body was never recovered. The official report blamed the harsh February weather, equipment failure, and the unfortunate reality that even experienced rangers can vanish without a trace in Idaho's unforgiving backcountry. But I was his partner. I was the one who found that camera. I was the one who developed those photographs in a freezing cabin while something howled in the darkness outside. Sounds that came from multiple directions, as if several creatures were communicating across the storm-lashed forest. For nearly 40 years, I've kept silent about what Jeff's camera captured in those final moments. About the 18-inch footprints with distinct toe impressions that I followed through the snow. About the massive, white-furred figure that stood upright like a man, but possessed proportions that belonged to no known creature on Earth. About the intelligence I saw in its posture as it systematically approached Jeff's position, moving with deliberate, calculated steps. The Forest Service buried the evidence. The photographs were filed away as inconclusive. The severed camera strap was dismissed as equipment failure. Jeff became another statistic, another ranger who paid the ultimate price for venturing too deep into the wilderness alone. But I know what killed Jeff Hartwell, and his camera proves it. The winter of 1985 to 86 was unlike anything we'd seen in the Panhandle. By January, snowfall had already exceeded seasonal averages by 300%. Temperatures plummeted to minus 30 Fahrenheit for weeks at a time. Transforming the forest into a crystalline tomb where even the hardiest wildlife struggled to survive. The isolation was complete. No tourists, no hunters, just Jeff and me manning the remote station near Priest Lake, monitoring conditions and waiting for spring. Our station sat at the convergence of 3 major watersheds, positioned strategically to monitor weather conditions and wildlife activity across nearly 50,000 acres of pristine wilderness. The building itself was a testament to 1960s government construction. Concrete block walls 2 feet thick, designed to withstand the brutal mountain winters that could isolate us for months at a time. Inside, banks of radio equipment connected us to the outside world through crackling transmissions that often failed when atmospheric conditions turned hostile. Jeff had been with the Forest Service for only 6 months when the reports started coming in, but his enthusiasm for the work had already marked him as exceptional among new recruits. He'd grown up in rural Montana, the son of a hunting guide who'd taught him to read tracks, weather patterns, and animal behavior with an intuition that couldn't be learned from textbooks. Where other rangers saw routine patrol duties, Jeff saw opportunities to contribute to genuine scientific understanding of wilderness ecosystems. The first eyewitness report arrived on a Tuesday morning in early October, delivered by Martha Kowalski, a 73-year-old woman who'd lived on the shores of Priest Lake for over 4 decades. Martha was known for her reliable observations. She'd helped us track migration patterns, document unusual weather events, and identify invasive plant species with the precision of a trained naturalist. When Martha called to report something unusual, we listened. She'd been splitting firewood behind her cabin when movement in the tree line caught her attention. At first, she assumed it was one of the neighborhood's semi-domesticated black bears making a final foraging run before winter denning. But as she watched, the creature stood upright and remained in that position for nearly 10 minutes, apparently observing her property with what she described as unnatural focus. The bear, if it was a bear, stood taller than any she'd encountered in 40 years of wilderness living. More disturbing was its coloration. Instead of the typical black or brown fur, this animal appeared to be covered in pale, almost white hair that seemed to shimmer in the afternoon sunlight. It moved with deliberate, purposeful steps rather than the shambling gait typical of bears. And when it finally disappeared back into the forest, it did so with a silence that defied its apparent size. Martha's account was followed within days by similar reports from other longtime residents. Bill Patterson, a retired logger who lived 5 miles north of Martha's place, encountered what he initially thought was a person in winter clothing walking along the ridgeline above his property. But the figure's proportions were wrong. Too tall, too broad, moving with strides that covered ground faster than any human could manage. When Bill called out a greeting, thinking it might be a lost hiker, the figure stopped, turned to look directly at him for several long moments, then continued along the ridge and disappeared. The Patterson sighting was particularly significant because Bill had worked these forests for 37 years. He knew the difference between human and animal movement, understood how distance and lighting conditions could create optical illusions, and possessed the kind of practical wisdom that comes from spending most of a lifetime in close contact with wilderness wildlife. When Bill Patterson said he'd seen something that didn't fit normal categories, his observations carried considerable weight. Throughout October and into November, the reports continued with troubling consistency. Eleanor Martinez, who managed a small campground near the lake's southern shore, found enormous footprints in the mud near her boat dock, prints that measured nearly 18 inches long and showed what appeared to be individual toe impressions. The prints were fresh, made sometime during the previous night, and led from the water's edge up to the tree line before disappearing on rocky ground that wouldn't hold clear tracks. At first, they seemed routine enough. Hikers and local residents claiming to have spotted an unusually large black bear in the vicinity of the lake's northern shore near the Canadian border. These sightings weren't uncommon. Black bears in northern Idaho can grow impressively large, and from a distance, especially in poor visibility, even experienced outdoorsmen can misjudge an animal's size. But there was something different about these reports. Every witness mentioned the same peculiar detail. The creature's fur appeared to be white, not the typical black or brown coloration we expected. Initially, we theorized it might be an albino black bear, what some call a spirit bear, though such specimens were extraordinarily rare in our region. The possibility intrigued us professionally. Documenting such a creature would represent a significant wildlife discovery for the Park Service. Throughout the autumn and early winter, the sightings continued with troubling consistency. Longtime residents who knew the difference between a bear and a moose, seasoned hunters who'd spent decades in these woods, all described encounters with something massive and pale moving through the forest, with an almost supernatural silence. The descriptions varied in detail but remained consistent in their essential elements: enormous size, white or cream-colored fur, and behavior that seemed oddly purposeful rather than the random foraging patterns typical of bears. Determined to document this elusive creature, we'd installed a series of primitive trail cameras along known animal corridors in November, before the heavy snows made travel impossible. The technology was basic by today's standards, motion-triggered cameras that use film rather than digital storage, but adequate for capturing evidence of wildlife activity. We positioned them near game trails, water sources, and areas where tracks had been reported, then settled in to wait for results. By February, with the forest locked in winter's grip and temperatures consistently below zero, we had little expectation of capturing anything significant. Bears should have been deep in hibernation, denned up until late March or even April, given the severity of the season. The forest had fallen into that profound winter silence where even the winds seemed muted by the weight of snow. When we finally retrieved the cameras after the first major blizzard of February, the images we developed sent chills down my spine that had nothing to do with the sub-zero temperatures. Frame after frame showed the same unsettling sight. Patches of white fur visible between the dark verticals of tree trunks, always just at the edge of clear definition, never fully revealed but unmistakably present. The creature, whatever it was, seemed to possess an uncanny ability to avoid direct exposure while remaining tantalizingly visible at the periphery of each shot. The photographs were maddening in their ambiguity, yet undeniably compelling. Something large and pale was moving through our forest in the depths of winter, when no bear should have been active. The implications troubled us both. If a bear was wandering during hibernation season, it likely meant the animal was sick, injured, or starving, a dangerous situation that could lead to aggressive encounters with humans. Such an animal would be unpredictable, potentially deadly, and almost certainly doomed without intervention. But the more we studied those blurry images, the more questions arose. The creature's movement patterns seemed wrong for a bear. The stride length suggested something with longer legs, and there were no clear shots of the characteristic bear profile we expected. Most puzzling of all, we found no supporting evidence. No scat, no claw marks on trees, no disturbed vegetation that would indicate a large animal's passage. Jeff's enthusiasm for solving this mystery bordered on obsession. He'd grown up in Idaho, spent his childhood exploring these same forests, and possessed that particular combination of scientific curiosity and outdoorsman's intuition that made him an exceptional ranger despite his relative inexperience. The possibility of documenting something unprecedented in our jurisdiction excited him in a way I hadn't seen since his arrival. Given the harsh conditions and our limited manpower, just the two of us covering thousands of acres, we'd established protocols for any field investigations. One ranger always remained at the station to maintain radio contact and coordinate with headquarters if emergencies arose. The other could venture out for short-duration patrols, but never without regular check-ins and predetermined return schedules. Jeff volunteered immediately when we decided someone needed to investigate the sightings more thoroughly. He packed his gear methodically, cold weather clothing, emergency supplies, radio equipment, and his prized Canon AE-1 program camera with telephoto lenses. The plan was straightforward: establish a temporary observation post near the area of highest sighting activity, document any evidence of the mysterious creature, and leave supplemental food if we encountered a starving bear. Before his departure, I emphasized the importance of maintaining radio contact every 4 hours and returning immediately if weather conditions deteriorated. The forecast called for another major storm system to move through within 48 hours, and I had no intention of losing a ranger to the elements over what might prove to be nothing more than misidentified wildlife. Jeff's initial radio reports were routine and reassuring. He had reached the designated area without incident, established an observation post with good sight lines, and begun documenting the terrain. His first observations noted the eerie quiet that had settled over the forest. Even the usual winter sounds of wind through branches and settling snow seemed muted. The cold was intensifying, he reported, but his equipment remained functional and his shelter adequate. His second check-in, scheduled for mid-afternoon, carried a subtle change in tone. The silence was becoming oppressive, he said, almost unnatural in its completeness. He'd found tracks, large ones, but they were partially obscured by recent snowfall and difficult to interpret. The weather was deteriorating faster than forecasted, with heavy snow beginning to fall and wind speeds increasing. He planned to shelter in an abandoned logging cabin he'd discovered rather than attempt a return in worsening conditions. That was the last coherent transmission I received from Jeff. His third scheduled check-in passed without contact. Initially, I attributed this to equipment problems. Radio batteries failed quickly in extreme cold, and atmospheric conditions could interfere with transmission. But as hours passed without any signal, anxiety began to gnaw at my confidence. Jeff was experienced enough to maintain communication schedules unless something was seriously wrong. By evening, with the storm intensifying and still no word from Jeff, I made the decision to contact headquarters and request backup. The response team couldn't deploy immediately due to the weather conditions, but they agreed to stage personnel at the nearest road access point for first light departure. I spent that sleepless night monitoring emergency frequencies and fighting the growing certainty that something had gone catastrophically wrong. The storm raged for 18 hours, dumping nearly 3 feet of fresh snow and creating whiteout conditions that made travel impossible even for experienced winter operators. When the winds finally subsided and visibility improved enough for safe movement, I couldn't wait for the backup team. Jeff had been out of contact for over 24 hours, and every additional minute could be critical if he was injured and exposed to the elements. I equipped myself with emergency medical supplies, additional radio equipment, and cold weather survival gear, then set out following Jeff's planned route toward his last known position. The landscape had been transformed by the storm. Familiar landmarks buried under snowdrifts, trails obliterated, and the forest wrapped in that peculiar silence that follows major winter weather events. The going was treacherous. Snow that looked solid would suddenly give way, plunging me knee-deep into hidden obstacles. The cold bit through my layers despite the specialized gear, and I found myself stopping frequently to prevent overheating and subsequent cooling that could lead to hypothermia. But I pressed on, driven by mounting fear for Jeff's safety and the nagging certainty that time was running out. 3 miles from the station, I encountered the first sign that Jeff had passed this way, but also the first indication that something was seriously amiss. His tracks were clearly visible in a section where wind had scoured away the fresh snow, revealing the packed base beneath. But alongside his boot prints were other impressions that stopped me cold. The tracks were humanoid but massive, easily 18 inches long and proportionally wide, with what appeared to be distinct toe impressions. The stride length was enormous, suggesting something with legs far longer than any human. Most unsettling of all, the tracks showed no drag marks or shuffling patterns typical of snowshoe travel, no indication of the careful, energy-conserving gait used by experienced winter travelers. Whatever had made these prints had moved through deep snow with an ease that defied rational explanation. I followed this dual trail for another half mile before losing it where wind and fresh snowfall had obscured the surface. But the implications of what I'd seen were inescapable. Jeff had not been alone in the forest. Something else, something large and bipedal, had been in the vicinity of his planned route. The realization forced me to confront possibilities I'd been trying to avoid since finding those first photographs weeks earlier. Jeff's systematic documentation hadn't been the random luck of a photographer stumbling across unusual wildlife. The creature had been aware of our activities, had been observing us just as we'd been trying to observe it. The carefully positioned trail cameras, our regular patrol patterns, even our radio communications. All of it had been monitored by an intelligence that understood human behavior well enough to avoid direct contact until circumstances suited its purposes. I thought back to the previous months, remembering incidents that had seemed insignificant at the time, but now took on sinister implications. equipment that had been moved during overnight stays at remote cabins, odd sounds that we'd attributed to settling timber or foraging animals. The persistent feeling of being watched during solo patrols, a sensation so common among wilderness workers that we'd learned to dismiss it as occupational paranoia. But paranoia suggested irrational fear, and there had been nothing irrational about the intelligence I'd glimpsed in those photographs. The creature hadn't stumbled into Jeff's camera range by accident. It had approached with calculated purpose, positioning itself to be documented while maintaining enough distance to avoid clear identification. Even now, following its trail through the snow, I was struck by the deliberate nature of its movement. No wasted steps, no random wandering, just purposeful progress towards some predetermined destination. The abandoned logging cabin Jeff had mentioned appeared exactly where he'd indicated, a sturdy structure that had weathered decades of harsh winters. Inside, I found clear evidence of his occupancy. His sleeping bag arranged near the stone fireplace, food supplies neatly organized, and equipment carefully positioned to prevent cold damage. But Jeff himself was nowhere to be found. What struck me most forcefully was the condition of the cabin. Nothing appeared disturbed or damaged. Jeff's gear was arranged exactly as a careful outdoorsman would organize it before venturing out temporarily. His radio sat on the wooden table, apparently functional when I tested it. Whatever had caused his departure from the shelter, it hadn't involved a struggle or emergency evacuation. I spent precious time searching the immediate vicinity, calling his name and looking for any indication of which direction he might have gone. The fresh snow had erased most surface evidence, but I eventually picked up faint traces of the same unusual tracks I'd encountered earlier. These led away from the cabin toward a heavily forested slope where the canopy had prevented complete snow coverage. Following this trail required careful navigation through dense undergrowth and around deadfall that the storm had brought down. The tracks were intermittent, visible only where wind patterns and topography had preserved them in the surface snow. But they led consistently in one direction, deeper into the backcountry, away from established trails and toward terrain that became increasingly difficult to traverse. After what felt like hours of careful tracking, I spotted something that made my pulse quicken. A flash of white among the dark tree trunks ahead, barely visible through the forest gloom. My first thought was relief. Jeff must be nearby, perhaps investigating the mysterious creature we'd been trying to document. I moved forward cautiously, trying to remain quiet while covering the distance between us. But as I drew closer, several details began to register that contradicted my hopeful assumptions. The white shape was too large, too tall to be human. It moved with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for something of its apparent size. And there was no sign of Jeff's distinctive winter clothing or equipment anywhere in the vicinity. I was still processing these observations when I literally stumbled over Jeff's camera. The Canon AE-1 program lay partially buried in snow at the base of a massive pine tree, its case cracked and lens housing damaged from impact. The camera strap had been severed, not torn or stretched to breaking, but cut with what appeared to be a sharp implement. Snow had drifted into the mechanism, but the film advance lever still functioned, suggesting the damage was recent. I retrieved the camera with hands that trembled from more than just cold. Jeff treated his equipment with religious care. The idea that he would abandon or drop his prized camera was inconceivable unless something catastrophic had occurred. The severed strap suggested the camera had been forcibly removed, but from what? And where was Jeff? The area around the camera location showed signs of disturbance despite the snow cover. Broken branches at heights well above human reach, disturbed vegetation, and what might have been the remnants of a struggle. But again, there were no clear human tracks, no blood, no torn clothing, none of the evidence I expected to find at the scene of an attack or accident. With growing dread, I realized I needed to process the film in Jeff's camera. Whatever had happened here, the photographs might provide crucial evidence. But first, I needed to continue searching for Jeff himself. The possibility that he was injured and sheltering nearby drove me to expand my search pattern despite the approaching darkness. I spent another hour combing the area, calling his name until my voice grew hoarse, following every possible lead and investigating every shadow that might conceal a human form. But as daylight faded and the temperature began its nightly plunge toward life-threatening levels, I was forced to accept that Jeff was not in the immediate vicinity. Reluctantly, I made my way back to the abandoned cabin to await the backup team and process the camera film using the portable developing kit I'd brought. The cabin provided shelter from the wind and enough ambient warmth to prevent the chemical solutions from freezing, but working by lamplight in sub-zero temperatures made every step of the development process a challenge. When the first images emerged in the developer solution, I understood why Jeff had been so excited about this assignment, and why he was now missing. The photographs were extraordinary and terrifying in equal measure. The early shots showed typical winter forest scenes, snow-laden branches, animal tracks, distant mountain peaks. But as I progressed through the roll, the images became increasingly focused on something that defied easy categorization. Jeff had captured a creature unlike anything in the zoological record. It stood upright like a human, but possessed proportions that were clearly non-human. The torso was massive, the arms disproportionately long, and the head sat atop shoulders so broad they suggested immense physical power. Most striking of all was the creature's covering, dense, white fur that seemed to absorb and reflect light in ways that made precise definition impossible. But these weren't the random, blurry shots typically associated with cryptid photography. Jeff had been systematic in his documentation, capturing the creature from multiple angles and distances. The images revealed intelligence in the creature's posture and movements, a purposeful quality that distinguished it from simple animal behavior. In several frames, the creature appeared to be observing Jeff directly, its massive head turned toward the camera position with what could only be described as curiosity. The facial features, while not clearly defined due to distance and fur coverage, suggested a disturbing blend of human and primitive hominid characteristics. The final photographs on the roll were the most unsettling. They showed the creature approaching Jeff's position, moving with deliberate steps through the forest. In one frame, it appeared to be testing the air, head raised and nostrils flared in a gesture so human-like it sent chills down my spine. Another image captured it examining a tree where Jeff had apparently carved his initials. The creature's massive fingers traced the marks with what could only be described as curiosity about human behavior. But it was the sequence of final shots that told the most disturbing story. The creature had circled Jeff's position, appearing in frames taken from different vantage points over what must have been several hours. It wasn't simply passing through the area, it was conducting a systematic study of the human in its territory. In some images, it crouched behind fallen logs, observing. In others, it stood partially concealed behind tree trunks, always maintaining visual contact while avoiding full exposure. The last clear image captured it reaching toward the camera with an arm that seemed impossibly long, fingers that appeared almost human but scaled to match the creature's enormous proportions. What struck me most about this final photograph was the expression, or what I could discern of expression through the dense facial hair. There was no aggression, no predatory intent. Instead, the creature's posture suggested something closer to diplomatic contact, as if it were attempting communication through the only medium available. After that, the remaining frames were either blank or showed only chaotic, out-of-focus images that might have been taken during a struggle or rapid movement. But one detail in these blurred shots caught my attention, what appeared to be multiple sets of legs moving through the frame. Jeff hadn't encountered a single creature operating alone. He'd stumbled into contact with an entire group, possibly a family unit or hunting party. The implications were staggering. If these creatures possessed the intelligence suggested by their systematic observation, if they operated in coordinated groups, and if they'd been monitoring our activities for months without detection, Then we were dealing with something far beyond a simple cryptozoological discovery. We were confronting evidence of a parallel intelligence that had developed sophisticated survival strategies in terrain we'd assumed was under complete human management. I sat in that frigid cabin, staring at photographs that challenged everything I thought I knew about the natural world, while somewhere in the storm-lashed forest, my partner remained missing. The evidence was undeniable. Jeff had encountered something extraordinary, something that existed beyond the boundaries of accepted scientific knowledge. And that encounter had gone terribly wrong. Outside the cabin, the wind began to pick up again, and I could hear sounds that made every nerve in my body tense with primitive alarm. Deep, resonant calls that echoed through the forest, not quite animal, not quite human, but carrying an intelligence that was unmistakably present. The calls seemed to come from multiple directions, as if several creatures were communicating across the dark landscape. I checked my rifle, ensuring it was loaded and ready, though I had serious doubts about the effectiveness of conventional weapons against something of the size and apparent strength revealed in Jeff's photographs. The calls continued sporadically throughout the night, sometimes distant, sometimes alarmingly close to the cabin. Each time I heard them, I fought the urge to investigate, knowing that venturing into the darkness alone would likely result in my own disappearance. The backup team arrived at first light, their snowmobiles announcing their approach long before they became visible through the trees. I met them at the cabin with Jeff's camera and the developed photographs, trying to explain the impossible situation we faced. The team leader, a veteran ranger named Harrison, who'd worked these forests for 20 years, examined the images with the skepticism I expected. But as he studied frame after frame of clear, undeniable documentation, his expression shifted from doubt to concern to something approaching fear. The other team members gathered around, their conversations becoming increasingly subdued as the implications of what they were seeing began to register. I led them to the location where I'd found the camera, pointing out the disturbed vegetation and unusual track impressions that remained visible despite the previous night's additional snowfall. Harrison knelt to examine the largest clear print, measuring it with a tape measure and photographing it from multiple angles. When he stood, his face was grim. The search for Jeff expanded to include the entire northern section of our patrol area, with additional teams called in from neighboring districts. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging equipment swept the region when weather permitted. Ground teams followed every possible lead, investigated every structure that could provide shelter, and documented every piece of potential evidence. But Jeff Hartwell was never found. The official investigation concluded that he had become disoriented during the storm and perished from exposure somewhere in the vast wilderness. His body, the report suggested, had likely been consumed by scavengers or buried under snow in a location that would remain hidden until spring thaw, if then. The explanation was rational, bureaucratically acceptable, and completely inadequate to explain the evidence we'd uncovered. Jeff's photographs were filed away in official records, classified as inconclusive due to distance and environmental conditions. The unusual tracks were attributed to natural formations or optical illusions created by snow patterns. The severed camera strap was explained as equipment failure under extreme conditions. But I knew better. I'd seen those photographs, heard those calls in the darkness, and felt the presence of something ancient and intelligent moving through our forest. Jeff hadn't died from exposure or become lost in familiar terrain. He'd encountered something that science insisted couldn't exist, and that encounter had cost him his life. The other rangers accepted the official explanation because it fit within their understanding of how the world worked. Bears killed people sometimes, cold killed people regularly, equipment failed, people made mistakes, and the wilderness claimed its victims with depressing frequency. These were known quantities, manageable risks that came with the job. But I couldn't forget the intelligence in that creature's posture, the systematic way it had approached Jeff's position, or the purposeful communication I'd heard that night in the cabin. this wasn't a random animal attack or a tragic accident. It was something far more complex and disturbing. The weight of that knowledge became unbearable. Every day in the forest brought memories of those photographs. Every routine patrol carried the possibility of another encounter. I began to dread the winter months when the creature or creatures seemed most active. Sleep became difficult, then impossible, as I found myself listening for those deep, resonant calls that announced their presence. By autumn of 1986, I'd submitted my resignation to the Forest Service. The official reason was family obligations, a need to relocate for personal reasons. But the truth was simpler and more shameful. I was afraid of what lived in those woods, afraid of what might happen to the next ranger who ventured too far from established trails, and afraid that someday I might share Jeff's fate. I moved to Denver and found work with the Parks Department, managing urban green spaces where the greatest danger was the occasional unleashed dog or inconsiderate jogger. I told no one about what I'd experienced, partly because I knew the story would be dismissed as fantasy, but mostly because talking about it brought back the fear and the guilt over Jeff's disappearance. For decades, I convinced myself that silence was the appropriate response. The creature had claimed one victim and then disappeared back into the depths of the wilderness. Perhaps it was a single individual, an anomaly that would eventually die and take its secrets with it. Perhaps speaking out would only endanger other people by encouraging them to seek out something that was better left alone. But recently, I've begun to reconsider that position. Reports of similar encounters have surfaced from other remote areas: Alaska, Northern California, the Pacific Northwest. Blurry photographs and shaky video footage appear on internet forums, dismissed by skeptics, but carrying details that match my own experiences too closely to be coincidental. More importantly, I've realized that my silence dishonors Jeff's memory and sacrifice. He died pursuing scientific knowledge, trying to document something extraordinary that challenged our understanding of the natural world. His photographs represent genuine evidence of a discovery that could revolutionize our understanding of human evolution and the diversity of life on Earth. Jeff Hartwell was an exceptional ranger and a good man who deserved better than to become a footnote in an official report that ignored the true circumstances of his disappearance. His camera captured images that provide concrete evidence for something that has been relegated to folklore and fantasy for too long. I'm sharing this account because I believe the public has a right to know what exists in our remote wilderness areas. People venture into these regions for recreation, research, and personal challenge, and they deserve to understand the full range of risks they might encounter. More importantly, scientists and researchers should have access to Jeff's photographs and the opportunity to investigate these phenomena with the resources and expertise they deserve. The creature Jeff documented may represent a surviving population of an unknown hominid species, a branch of human evolution that diverged from our own lineage hundreds of thousands of years ago. Such a discovery would reshape our understanding of anthropology, biology, and our place in the natural world. It might also explain the persistent legends and folklore traditions that describe similar beings across multiple cultures and geographic regions. But it would also confirm that we share this planet with intelligences that possess capabilities and motivations we don't understand. The creature in Jeff's photographs displayed a level of awareness and purposeful behavior that suggests sophisticated cognitive abilities. It avoided direct confrontation with our cameras for months while apparently observing our activities, then approached Jeff with what seemed like calculated intent. These aren't mindless beasts driven by simple hunger or territorial instincts. They're thinking beings with their own agenda, their own understanding of their relationship with humans, and our encroachment into their domain. That realization is both fascinating and deeply unsettling. I often wonder what Jeff's final moments were like. Did he realize what he was documenting? Was he afraid or excited by the magnitude of his discovery? Did the creature kill him quickly, or was there some form of communication between them? The questions haunt me because the answers died with Jeff in that remote forest 4 decades ago. Sometimes I imagine that Jeff is still alive somewhere, held captive by creatures that recognized his intelligence and potential value. It's an irrational hope, but one that provides some comfort against the more likely reality that he was killed either deliberately or accidentally during that first encounter. What I know with certainty is that something extraordinary lives in the remote wilderness areas of North America, something that possesses intelligence, physical capabilities, and behavioral patterns that don't match any known species. Jeff's photographs provide clear evidence of this reality, and his disappearance demonstrates that these encounters can have deadly consequences. The Forest Service, along with other government agencies, has chosen to suppress this information rather than acknowledge findings that would challenge public assumptions about wilderness safety and scientific understanding. Their decision is understandable from a bureaucratic perspective. Such revelations would create panic, drive away tourism revenue, and force a complete reevaluation of land management policies. But suppression serves no one's interests in the long run. These creatures exist whether we acknowledge them or not. People will continue to encounter them whether we provide warning or not. And the scientific opportunity represented by Jeff's documentation will be lost if researchers aren't allowed to pursue investigation based on genuine evidence. I'm approaching 80 years of age now, and I won't carry the secret much longer. Jeff's photographs are safely stored in a location where they'll survive my passing, along with detailed documentation of the circumstances surrounding their capture. Someone with more courage than I've shown will eventually ensure that Jeff's final contribution to science receives the attention it deserves. Until then, I can only offer this warning to anyone planning to venture into remote wilderness areas, particularly during winter months when these creatures seem most active. You are not alone in those forests. Something ancient and intelligent watches from the shadows, something that possesses capabilities we don't understand and motivations we can't predict. Jeff Hartwell died trying to document the greatest zoological discovery of the modern era. His photographs prove that science has barely scratched the surface of what exists in the unexplored corners of our world. I hope that someday his sacrifice will be recognized for what it truly was, the price paid for knowledge that challenges everything we thought we knew about the natural world and our place within it. The creature in those photographs is still out there. Jeff's disappearance proves that these encounters don't always end with blurry footage and disputed testimonials. Sometimes they end with good people vanishing into the wilderness, leaving behind only questions that no one wants to answer. I've lived with those questions for 40 years. Now it's time for others to confront the evidence and decide what should be done about the intelligence that shares our forests and mountains. Jeff's camera captured proof of something extraordinary. Whether that proof leads to scientific breakthrough or continued suppression will depend on people with more courage than I've managed to summon. But I owe it to Jeff's memory to ensure that his final work isn't lost to bureaucratic convenience or public skepticism. Somewhere in the Panhandle National Forest of northern Idaho, something killed the best ranger I ever worked with. Jeff's photographs show exactly what that something looks like. The question now is whether anyone will have the courage to go looking for it again. For more interesting stories like this, check this one out.